Hi everyone, we're going to continue on from the last video and we're going to create our logo. Okay, so we're going to pop back over to Illustrator for a second and we're then going to double check a couple of things. So when we're bringing in a logo like this into Maya, we in this example what I'm going to do is bring them in as the curves. Okay, and I need to be mindful of things like this hole here, or also the inside of shapes like this, or the inside of letters. It's going to bring these in as separate curves, and so it's very easy sometimes to actually create 3D objects out of the holes instead of using them to cut holes through the shapes. Okay, so if you're doing a logo for a client, double check their design to make sure you know which curves are supposed to be holes and which curves are supposed to be 3D parts of the actual design. Okay, that's especially true for text. Obviously with a lot of text you've got holes through them depending on the font that you use. If you are going to be creating some kind of text, okay, like something like this, I'll just increase the size there so you can see that more clearly. If you're going to be producing text where you've got holes in the text like this, what you need to do is select your text and then go to Type, Create Outlines, Shift Control 0 or Shift Command. That's actually an O, not a 0. So Shift Control or Shift Command O, and that will create outlines. So these are now shapes. They're no longer a font or a text. They're now objects. Maya can read this. It cannot read the text by itself, so you've got to do outlines. Okay, so let's get rid of that. So what I've got here is essentially a star, basically with this hole cut out of it, and then I have this background kind of glyph, and that has a hole cut out of it as well. So those things are going to come out as sort of curves as well. Now the other thing that you'd want to do is kind of optimize your shapes, your actual curves, and get rid of any excess points. This glyph in the background, this red shape, was actually a font. It was a letter or a character from a font, which basically is just a whole bunch of different glyphs. Now the issue there is that I've created an outline, just like I've shown you with that text, but the computer's going to try and guess the best way of laying the outline out, and so you end up with all these extra points in here. That's going to kind of potentially cause mess. So normally what I would do if I was designing a logo is I would make sure that my shape paths, these lines, are nice and neat and tidy and don't have these excess kind of corners. Okay, usually these kind of things will occur anywhere there's curves, especially if there's curved edges like this that then lead into another corner like this. It'll try and kind of create a transition, and so you'll find that there's loads of those on a lot of the corners in here. The reason that that's no good for bringing across to Maya is that sometimes these can be a bit twisted around, and then that causes errors in your shape in Maya, and sometimes it can prevent the curve from actually working at all, and you might have to come back in and kind of fix it. I know that this one will work, so I'm not going to really be that picky with it. I'm just going to bring it in as it is, but just be aware of that. Sometimes you want to try and avoid having all these extra messy things. You can do, there's like a there is like a simplify curve tool in Maya, and potentially you could even remove the excess points in Maya before you create the 3D kind of effect, but that's just something to keep in mind. All right, let's get to the crazy bit. So once you're happy with your design, you can see that I've got, you know, some of these things are grouped, some of them aren't, so the text is kind of grouped and so on. Maya ignores all of that. Okay, it doesn't care about the layers or anything like that. The one thing you do have to double check though, is that you don't have any guides in your file. Okay, I'm going to create a guide and show you, because it does have a major effect in Maya. So if I go to View and I switch on Guides and I hit I can see hide guides is there, which means guides currently will be visible if I create one. So that's essentially what I want. If I drag let's say I've been trying to align things in Illustrator, and I click and drag in the ruler across into my file, it's going to create this line, which is called a guide. And I can use this to line things up and so on in my Illustrator file. The problem with the way that this is generated is that it is, in essence, a line just like you would draw with the line tool or the pen tool. And you can see here, no matter how far I kind of drag up in the document, it just keeps going. This line is infinite. And so when you bring this into Maya, Maya is going to try and create a line, a curve that goes into infinity. So if you've got one of these in your file, it can cause massive problems in Maya. So what you need to do before you save this out is you need to clear the guides. You can't just hide them because they're still there and Maya will still load them in. So you have to go to View, Guides, Clear Guides, just here. Right? Now lock guides is on, which means it's locking them. So I'm going to turn that off. And if I go View, Guides, now normally it should allow me to clear them. But it's not doing that. That's a bit weird. Technically speaking, what you can do, if you've unlocked them, you can select it and hit delete and remove them like that. Okay. You've just got to make sure you don't have any guides in. Okay. Now, if you try and do a bevel straight out with the Illustrator tool in Maya, and you've got guides, it will just give you an error message and it won't work. If you do what we're about to do, which is bring them in as curves, it will bring the guide in as a curve, as I said, but it'll be an infinitely long line. And if you try and zoom, if you press A to zoom to all, Maya is just going to zoom out infinitely, almost like Ant-Man shrinking infinitely down into the quantum realm. It's sort of a similar idea. It just keeps going forever, and your software might freak out. Okay, let's save this. We're going to go File. We're going to go Save. Now, don't forget, I've saved this as an Illustrator 8 file format. Okay, so if you're not sure, just go File, Save As, and then give it a name. Just say Save. You got to hit Save twice. It's going to ask me if I want to overwrite it. And you've just got to make sure it's an Illustrator 8 file. And then just hit OK. All right, let's jump over to Maya. Okay, so we're in Maya. And what I'm going to do is open up my Illustrator tool. So I'm going to go to Create, Adobe Illustrator Object Options. And I'm going to set this to curves. I'm not going to try and create a 3D object straight away. Because I want to be able to control how many polygons are in each of those parts, right? So I'm going to go to curves and I'm going to hit create, and it's going to pop up my dialog box, my file dialog. And what I want to do is select my All-Star logo just here. And I'm going to hit open. And you can see there, it pops it in like this. Now this file somehow is reading where the origin is actually at the bottom rather than at the top. So this one pops out above. No big deal, because we're going to move this anyway. Now you'll notice over here, because it's curves, it's loaded them in as individual curves, okay, inside here, inside a bigger group, right? So these compound curves, you can see that this compound curve is this outer curve of the icon, okay, or the glyph, and then it has an outer curve and an inner curve, okay? So this is two curves to make up a compound curve just here. And it's done the same with the other ones as well, where that's pertinent. None of that really matters, okay? What we're going to do is take the main group, okay, and that's normally what is selected to begin with. And what we're going to do is center the pivot point. So we can click Center Pivot, or we can come up to Modify Center Pivot just here. Turn on your Move tool as well. And I can see here that it's a little bit off center. I want the pivot point to be lined up right in the middle of this circle, which is in line with the points on the star here. So if I hit the D key like this, and then I switch on Snap to Points, I can then grab this X handle, drag it across, and move my cursor up to the point on the star here. And that's going to align the middle of the handle up with that. Turn off my snap to points and press the D key again to deactivate the edit pivot. Now what I can do is switch on snap to grid, just here, and then I can grab this middle handle and drag it to the middle of the grid down here, and that's going to basically reposition the whole thing there. Then all I do is turn off snap to grid, and then I can freeze as transformations, and that'll lock this in place. Now you'll notice over here on the channel box, there's no input history on this group. Let's just freeze those transformations, modify, freeze transformations. So now the middle of the grid is now the new position for the object. Now you can see here that the curves themselves, when you select those, they do have just the normal curve shape attributes, but there's no history on any of these. Okay, it's sort of like a fresh object. Okay, so at this point what we can do is start using a tool called Bevel Plus to actually bevel these shapes out into three-dimensional objects. And because we're doing this sort of one by one, or section by section, we can adjust the settings as we go along in order to create different depths and also different amounts of curvature and so on. So I'm going to start with the background glyph first. Actually, you know what, I'm going to start with the text. I'm thinking about the way that the file is set up, and I think the text is going to be a better example to begin with, okay? Because there is going to be an issue with the text. Okay, so first things first, we've got to find the bevel, the actual Bevel Plus tool, okay? Now, if we come up to the Surfaces menu here, keep in mind we're in the Modeling tab. So if I go to Surfaces, we've got Bevel Plus just here. Okay. Now the reason it's under Surfaces and it's not under Curves is that the Curves menu is about creating curves. We've already created the curves. What we are wanting to do now is create objects or surfaces from those curves. So we want to use the Surfaces menu to create surfaces. So we come to Bevel Plus. I'm going to open the options. You'll see these options are virtually identical to the Adobe Illustrator options that we looked at in the last video. These are exactly the same, okay? And they function the same way. So what we're going to do is use these default settings to create a three-dimensional object from one of these letters. I'm going to start with the L here because it's out in the open. It's not overlapping with anything else. So I'm going to select the curve and I'm going to press this apply button down here. Now the only thing that has been changed is this value just here. The extrude distance is set to 1. We can see that if we go up to edit and hit reset settings, you can see everything else is the same except the extrude distance change. I'm going to set it to 1. That way it's going to give me a nice thick letter. Okay. Then I'm going to press apply. What this does is it applies the tool, but it keeps this option box open so that if I want to change settings for the next one, I don't have to go back up to the menu and open the options again. So apply. All right, so you can see that letter has popped out. Now notice that it's popped out and gone backwards. There is a reason for that. And the reason is that the curves for the letters are actually reversed. They're sort of the wrong way round compared with the other objects in the file. And I know that because I've done multiple tests with this file, and you won't notice it until you've done it yourself. Okay, so I'm sort of looking into the future here. I can see sort of, I know what's going to happen with this file. Now, the reason I've done it this way is so that you can see how to fix this issue. Okay. Now, you can fix it in real time. You don't have to undo this. You can actually change a setting here or activate a tool and it'll fix. So what I'm going to do is select the curve for that letter. Now, sometimes it's a bit fiddly, and if you try to click and you cannot select the curve, what you can do is come up to the top here and switch off surfaces. This will stop you being able to select the object, and it'll only allow you to click on the curve like this. So if I select the curve and then I come up to curves and right down the bottom here, reverse direction, it will reverse the direction of the curve and the object will then extrude out of the front of the curve like this. And this is what we want. Okay. So now what I can do is just go and apply that to the rest of the letters. Now I know the rest of the letters are going to be backwards as well. Now that's not always true of every file you bring in. Sometimes some of the parts of the letters are inside out and some of them aren't, or backwards. So usually what I would do is go through and apply the bevel to all of my letters like this, and then I will go and reverse the curves of the ones that are backwards. Now notice if you've got a letter that's made up of two pieces, do them separately. Okay, select one piece, then select the other. If you select both at the same time, it won't work. You've just got to select one curve at a time. Now, for those of you that might be in future doing a logo with text with holes through, I am going to show you that, but I'm going to use this glyph because the glyph has a hole in the middle. So things like the letter, like a lowercase a or an O or a P or something like that, you can use this tool, but there's a way of doing it, which I'll show you in a minute. So at the moment, we're just dealing with block capitals with no holes through them. Okay, so I can see now that half my letters or all of my letters have gone backwards except for that one that I've fixed. What I can do now is I can go through and just select all of the curves for those parts of the letters that are backwards, and I can reverse them all at the same time. So we go to curves, reverse direction, and it'll flip them all, and now they all pop out forwards like this. So that works quite well. Now if I decide that these are too thick, I can come over to the attribute editor over here, and that'll give me essentially these settings, and I can change the attributes for each individual letter, and that will adjust the thickness. Okay, I can't change the settings here in the options for the tool because these have already been made. If I do change these settings, which I will do in a second, it will be for any new extrusions or bevels that I do. Okay, so let's now do the star. Now with the star, what I'm going to do is I'm going to halve the extrude distance because I don't want it to be as thick as the letters. So I'm just going to change this to 0.5. And what I might do is get rid of the bevels, okay? So I just want a flat front. I don't want these little edges. So I'm going to turn off bevel at start and bevel at end. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to select both curves for the star, the outer curve and the inner curve. Okay, now this is what it would be the same as a letter with a hole in it, like an O, okay? You'd select the outer and the inner. And then I'm going to apply that. And you can see there, the inner curve gets cut out of the outer curve. So it's really easy to do. There's no Boolean systems or anything that you've got to use to actually cut holes through. Now, because I switched off the bevel, create bevel options, it has not given me these edges. Okay, it's just given me a flat shape like that. Now I can do the same thing for the shape of the back. And you can see here I've selected the inner piece first and then the outer piece. For the star, I did the outer and then the inner. And I'm just going to show you that it doesn't really kind of change anything. All right. Now this time I'm going to do the extrude distance a bit bigger. So I'm going to go 1.5. So the glyph at the back is going to be the thickest piece. And I'm going to switch the bevels back on. So I'm going to hit create bevel at start, create bevel at end, like this. And this time what I'm going to do is create a convex, let's go convex out, like this. Okay, so I'm changing this a little bit, and I'll show you the difference that makes. Then I'll hit apply, and you can see here we've got an error. All right, now that might be because of the convex out setting. So if I reset this back, we can kind of try it again. No problem there. Let's try selecting these the other way around. Yep, there we go. So in that case, it wanted me to select the outer curve and then the hole. All right. Now in the past, when I've done that in that order, it does tend to work that way. So you can see that it will prefer you to do the outer shape and then the inner shape. Okay. Now you can also see that one has gone backwards as well. Now for this, that's fine, because if it extruded forwards, it would have gone all the way through the other shapes and we would have had to have moved the object backwards. So it's kind of worked out that way. So everything's kind of lined up nicely. There we go. Now let's take a look at what happened with the I actually reset the edge there, just in case that was causing the problem. Let's take a look at how you can modify some of these things. So I'm going to close off those options, and I'm going to switch on the wireframe option just here so you can see the lines. And let's just select the background object. We've got to turn on the surfaces. Let's select this one. And what I'm going to do is come across the attributes and go into the Bevel Plus options. So you can see here we've got the same settings as we did in the option box. But now if we change these, it's going to modify the object because these settings are connected to the object. So for instance, if I turn off bevel at end, it's going to get rid of the bevel on the front of the object back here. But you can see when you do that, it causes these errors. All right, I turn it back on, it's going to switch back to there. Obviously, if I go bevel at start, it's going to do the same thing on the front, right? Now, keep in mind, the start option is where the curve is. So the curve is along here. It's not at the back here. On these objects, the curve is here, and they've extruded forward. So the end on the letters is at the front, and the end for the glyph at the back is at the back here. Okay, you get kind of used to that. Now these curve styles here, we can pop in here, and it gives us this drop down, and this will change the edging just here, right? So if I select something like a convex out, which is what I was going to do before, you can see it actually rounds the edges off. So instead of them being straight like this, they're now curved. If I do something like a, let's go with a convex side edge, you can see there what it does is it creates this sort of kind of pillar effect just here. And they've got all sorts of different ones. So convex crease, it's going to give you kind of like that shape where it kind of bends in. So there's a whole range of different ones that you can use. Now let me just double check. That's going to be that one. I'm just going to reset this back to straight out. Okay, but that's how you would change the profile of the edges. Now, if you wanted to change the extrude distance, you just dial this and adjust the thickness. Okay, if you want to increase how far the bevel reaches, you can change the bevel width and the depth. The width is how far out it extrudes this way, and the depth is how far it pops out front and back. So you can see as I change the depth, it's doing it this way. So I can change how big that bevel is. Keep in mind, you don't want to push too far, because what happens is, because I've got all those points on the corners that I pointed out in Illustrator, if these flip, if these kind of cross over each other or flip each other, the whole thing tends to scramble up and you get all these errors, and the shape will no longer work properly. So you have to be careful with not making these bevel values too big or too small. Usually the extrude distance doesn't impact on that though, so that's usually okay. So I'm just going to set these back to 0.1 like that. So that's more or less how you get a three-dimensional logo. You can then just pretty much animate these and texture them, or adjust them, create sort of extrusions and things off them, just like any other object. These are just now polygon objects. Now you will find there's a couple of things you need to be aware of. Text, block text, these kinds of block letters, big simple letters, work the best. Doing handwritten fonts where they're very curvy, or things like fonts, like horror style fonts with like ink splats or blood splatter and stuff, those more often than not will not work properly because there's just too much detail with them. So usually with this kind of thing, you want to try and stick with sort of more simple fonts, kind of maybe tech looking fonts, sci-fi type fonts, or big block letter fonts. Things like handwriting, or a lot of sort of script type fonts may not work very well, or they won't work at all. And you might find even sometimes they can crash the software entirely. So generally speaking, it works better for this kind of simplified font. Now, you can animate these values as we've sort of played around with animating attributes before. So, for example, you know, we could right click on extrude distance and actually animate the extrude distance. So just as an example, if I set the value at 1, you know, if I've got it set to here, and then I set a key, and then I come down the timeline, and then I increase the value to 10, like this, and then I right click on that and hit set key, that value is now going to animate over time. So I can create like kind of, you know, kind of 80s style streaking text where the text comes flying past, you know, like this. And obviously I could actually animate the position of the text as well. So, you know, like if I come down to 50 and I set a keyframe there for the object, and then I go back to frame 1 and I bring this out, set a keyframe there. So then when I bring my logo in, you know, I could do something like that. And then sort of here, I can then set this back down to 1 and keyframe that, set key. So what I get is basically this text kind of stretches in. It stretches into shot like that. So I can do that kind of thing. Obviously it's going to look a bit better if it's back here. So it kind of stretches in and does that. Obviously you've got to imagine that that would be a bit further back behind the camera to begin with. You know, so this object might actually be sort of way back here. And then it kind of stretches into place and then does that. So you can do that kind of thing, you know, it's pretty basic. So a lot of these can be keyframed, just as we've done with other things. Okay, I'm going to leave this here. So that's the Adobe Illustrator tool. As I said, the text tool, which is also under the Create menu just here, the Type tool, works in a very similar way. It has similar settings, although now what they've done is they've actually changed the interface for it. The interface used to be exactly the same as the Illustrator tool, and what they've done now is turn it into this thing where it creates 3D text and then you've got to edit it in here. So you've got like your font, your text size and all that kind of thing. So it works the same way though, you know, you can adjust the tracking and you know, you can just type stuff in and it changes. So text tool's a bit easier to use, but more or less if you can use the Adobe Illustrator tool, you can use the text tool. Okay, this is the more complicated of the two. Okay, we'll leave this here and I will see you again soon.